And we're back. Dr. Feist here once again, and I'm still talking about the Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, still in Book 5, on to Chapter 4 now. And I'm working here with my team of Winnie the Pooh and Tigger.
Hello.
And so what have we talked about? Well, in the few chapters leading up to this, and in 4, 5, and 5, we're going to see that justice for Aristotle is not one single thing. So this you can think of as reminiscent of Aristotle's earlier discussion back in Book 1, Chapter 6. It's the same kind of spirit there where he says, look, the good is not one single thing that can be predicated across the categories. There's problems if you try and do that. And if you recall from those previous videos of that discussion, Aristotle points out a number of difficulties when you think that the good is just one thing. Same thing, the same sort of, shall we say, the same spirit is animating Aristotle's discussion here. Justice isn't one single thing, and it's going to change, so that the idea of justice isn't a single big Platonic idea either. And if you notice in Aristotle's examples in a couple of these chapters, they're quite basic examples. They're quite down to earth. So he's not talking about like really justice in this big picture like the Platonists. So once again, as Aristotle has tried to bring the notion of good down to earth and said, well, there'd be different kinds of goods, the same thing. Justice is now brought down, and there's justice in different contexts. So sometimes it means one thing, sometimes it means another. And what we want to think about is what's sort of the general background concept that links all these different species of justice, as Aristotle will call them. So what's the genus of justice? And we'll see a little bit more on that later. But it's not just one big picture of justice, more or less, that you have in Plato. So remember that justice in chapter 3, so I'm talking about chapter 4, but just recall from chapter 3, justice was about the distribution of goods. That's your first species. In chapter 4, you're going to have your second species of justice, and he'll call that rectificatory justice. In the first one, it was justice as distribution of goods, or distributive justice. And in this sense, he was talking about goods as in a common property, sort of amongst the community. What are the goods that are shared, like honor, public office? And if you recall, I looked at various examples, because if you change the principle of distribution, who qualifies for those goods, you'll get different shapes of society. If it's just the very wealthy that qualify for the distributions of things like public office, you'll get a certain kind of society. If it's just the highly intelligent, the well-educated that qualify, you'll get a certain kind of society. If it's all those people of a free birth, you get a certain kind of society. How you pick from those groups of who qualifies, those subsets of society, like the very wealthy or the very well-educated, how you pick from those, that's your manner of distribution. That's not as important, Aristotle says, as the principle. And the principle will basically tell you the basic structure of your society. And so Aristotle opens it up and gives us a variety of examples to think about. Now, with justice as distribution of goods, it's really thinking about justice among unequal persons, because Aristotle is very clear. We're not all equal in society. And as I looked at in the previous video, that's not the point of distributive justice, is to make everybody the same or make everybody equal. No, not at all. As a matter of fact, it's more of a conservative, small c, conservative notion of justice, which is to preserve kind of the status quo. And the status quo is of people have unequal powers, unequal distribution of goods. But how do you maintain the justice of this distribution of goods? It's not all to be haphazard. So it's not all random. In other words, there is a kind of mathematics to it, and it's a little interesting that Aristotle, after he tells us ethics is not mathematics, and he makes a big case out of that, and he also insists that when you're doing ethics, you have to be careful that you don't rely on mathematics, because if you recall, he talked about the rigor of the investigation has to match the subject that you're investigating. That's proper methodology. Nonetheless, Aristotle uses a couple of mathematical terms here to make his points a little bit more clear. And he says, well, in the case of the distribution of goods in the first species of justice, it's a geometric one. In other words, he's preserving relationships between wholes. So you have parts of wholes, and they have to have certain relationships to the whole. So there's a ratio or a proportion of the part to the whole, and then the wholes to each other have to be in the same kind of proportion. Sounds a lot more complex than it is, but it goes roughly like this. If A and B are persons and C and D are goods, so these are persons and these are goods, well, the distribution that's just, the just distribution, this first species, is going to have to preserve these kinds of ratios, or these kinds of proportions. So this whole, okay, so there's a whole comprised of A to B. So the proportion of A to B has to match that of C to D. Right? That's what the whole idea of this middle operator is, says that the proportions are holding. So it's the same relationship that A has to B that C has to D. If you permute these, right, that is if you start distributing the goods over A and B, you have to distribute them in order to preserve the proportions. So you would have to distribute them. So if in this sense, A is to C as B is to D. So in that sense, you've preserved the proportions. So the proportions are all preserved, so that is preserved, just like here. So the relationships between the parts are preserved, and the relationships between wholes are preserved, and that is the geometric one. And in this case, because there is a proportion, right, between two persons, that means that they're not identical, they're not equal, but they're proportionate. So if you think, what do you mean by proportionate? Well, one person might be just more important and get more goods. For Aristotle, for instance, you know, if you're somebody who's doing something in society, maybe you have more of a right to something. And he doesn't use the language of rights, but it would be just that you get more. So in one sense, somebody who's, I don't know, it's hard to say exactly, but somebody who's maybe contributed, in Aristotle's view, if you've contributed so much, maybe you get more back from the public share of goods, the common goods, than someone who's contributed less. Now, what's interesting is, you know, a lot of people don't agree with that nowadays. We have different understandings of what justice is in terms of shall we say, the goods in common property. But Aristotle is quite clear. It's not just you just hand it all out to everyone equally, because he does have the notion of who qualifies, and some people won't qualify for public goods in the same way that others will. So holding public office, for example, for Aristotle, you decide, and Aristotle wouldn't say something like, well, that's open to everybody. Like in modern liberal democracy, like Canada, there's very few restrictions on holding public office, right? It's basically open to the citizenry. If you're a citizen, you can hold public office, right? Now, there might be a few legal restrictions, but by and large, if you haven't run afoul of the law or something like that, you can hold public office. That would not be the case for Aristotle. So it's really trying to figure out the notion of justice among unequal persons, but there's sort of equal goods, like, you know, a piece of public office, like somebody who's managing something for the city in charge of money, or a treasurer or whatever. How do you distribute those kinds of powers among unequal persons? And the important thing here is that this distribution of goods it's not to make everybody equal. Justice in this sense of distribution of goods isn't trying to level the playing field. It's actually trying to preserve the inequalities in the correct ratios, so that you're not, as we would say now, the state doesn't pick winners and losers and adjusts things to make people who are in the lower end up higher and the higher end lower. No, it seeks to preserve those kinds of proportions. All right, so that's the whole notion of justice in the sense of preserving proportions when it comes to distributions. So that's the essence of the previous. And in chapter 4 now, we have another species of justice. And again, we have the arithmetic notion, or the mathematical notion. Here it's arithmetic. And Aristotle calls this rectificatory justice. And that's the translation I'll use. It's basically giving people back what they deserve in a sense. But here we're talking more or less about equal persons, equal goods. These are like simple kinds of transactions. These aren't the heavy-duty communal ones. Aristotle will talk about that in chapter 5. So in chapter 4, he's talking of a more simple kind of justice, so to speak. And the voluntary is things like, like simple exchanges. Right? Very simple type of exchanges, simple kinds of transactions, almost kind of like a barter, right? Where it's easy to exchange things, not very complicated. We're not even in the land really seriously of money. That's later on. And I'll deal with that in the next video, and Aristotle deals with that in the next chapter. So it's a very sort of simple kind of exchange of things when they're voluntary. There's simple voluntary exchanges where people know and agree to what's going on. And then the involuntary is when people don't know and probably won't agree. So in this sense, we're talking about the involuntary with things that are secret, like theft or there's a poisoning. And of course, Aristotle uses in the involuntary, the secret, like enticing away someone's slaves. So in that sense, you clearly get an idea of Aristotle in his notions of justice. As I mentioned in a previous video, enticing away slaves, Aristotle regards as a species of injustice, right? It is something that you're doing that's basically Aristotle would say is morally wrong, to try and entice a slave to leave that slave's owner. And there's, in addition to the secret, there's the one by force, like assault, imprisonment, slander, and maiming. So we've gone now from this more complex notion of justice as distribution of goods and goods in a common property, more of a societal notion, to more simple kinds of exchanges with regarding equal people, because Aristotle says if someone steals from another, it's a matter of stealing, right? And that's got to be corrected, rectified. So it's sometimes called corrective justice. It doesn't matter if it's a bad person who was stolen from or a good person or whatever. That's really irrelevant. We're just talking about equals and we want to correct things. So for here, these simple kinds of transactions, again, we see how Aristotle is trying to break with that large-scale notion of the good, large-scale notion of justice, as Plato did. And here we have justice as more of something we might recognize, because when you think of it, Aristotle is approaching in this notion of rectificatory justice of equal persons. The notion of justice is, as we would say today, justice is actually supposed to be sort of blind, right? The law is blind. That's why you have the scales and the figure personifying justice. She usually has a blindfold on, that it's not important what your status is or who you are or whatever. You're treated as an abstract kind of subject. Something has been wronged, who has been wronged, and the purpose of justice is to step in and make things right again. And Aristotle in this chapter even gives, as I said, it's arithmetic. He gives a little description of what is supposed to happen in the notion of justice. It concerns itself primarily with keeping things, the powers and balances preserved. So if power gets out a little bit between two individuals, Aristotle says the whole point is to bring it back down and bring both people into alignment. So if you say, for example, that one person takes two people that are in this exchange, and it's an involuntary one, and it's, let's say, a forced one where it's some kind of stealing, or theft or whatnot. In this case, if person A, let's say, takes 4 units of something, whatever, from person B, then A has his amount, plus those 4 units that he has stolen, and B has his amount, but minus those 4 units. So you have an excess of, A is on the excess, B's on the deficiency. So the whole idea is an arithmetic one, is simply to remedy and bring A back down from the excess and to raise B up, and the net result is that A and B, shall we say, meet in the mean. So it's reducing excesses and augmenting deficiencies. So in that sense, we've got kind of the beginnings of equal persons, equal goods. We're at the beginnings of more of a sense of justice that we might recognize. Now, keep in mind that this is also, shall we say, with simple exchanges. These are kind of exchanges where something can happen and there might be a judge might need to be brought in and then perform some sort of mediation. As Aristotle said, that's what sometimes we call judges. They're looking for the mean. They're mediators. They're bringing things to kind of to the middle in some arithmetic sense. So it's a pretty straightforward notion of justice. And in that sense, the simple exchanges they're not really binding people in communities. The exchanges that are, shall we say, larger, more complex, more ongoing, those are more involved issues of justice. Those are more complex societies. Aristotle's going to talk about that in the next chapter. For this one, it's just simple types of exchanges, almost maybe on the level of barter and simple and petty theft. In the next video, and in the next chapter, Aristotle will look at his third species of justice, which is going to be a lot more complex. But for now, we've had two species of justice, one which is fairly complex, dealing and talking about communities. Then we did the second one, which is a little less complex. And in the next video, we'll look at the more complex notion of justice, which is, as you can think, is a kind of political justice. So stay tuned for that.
Well, better be bouncing along. The wonderful thing about Tiggers is Tiggers are wonderful things. They're bouncy, trouncy, flouncy, pouncy, fun, 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 fun. But the most wonderful thing about Tiggers is I'm the only one.